So today I want to start with a very brief clip of Michel Foucault. He speaks a bit in English first of all, then he goes into French. And the purpose of showing this is really just really to emphasize why we are doing these sessions. So let me just play Michel Foucault.
Answer in French because my English is so bad that I would be ashamed to answer in English. Là, il est vrai que je me méfie un peu de cette notion de nature humaine. Mais je m'en méfie pour la raison suivante. Je crois que...
So part of the reason for putting together these sessions is that there are so few recordings of these distinguished thinkers that we have. This is the one I could find where he was speaking mainly in French, of course. So he gave many lectures at in English when he was teaching at UC Berkeley. But we don't have many. And as we shift from an age where the podcast has become increasingly important, it struck me as being a vital sort of component that were able to put together and record some discussions by leading experts as a repository for students worldwide. Each of these sessions will be uploaded and will be available for everybody around the world as a resource, and to collect thoughts and ideas, not only through experts of in this particular area, but also from those who actually studied under these particular individuals. And I think Sanford Quinter in particular stands out because he was a student of Foucault in Paris many years ago. So who was Michel Foucault? He was born in 1926 in Poitiers in France. He came from a long family of surgeons, and his father expected him to go into medicine, but instead he went into philosophy. And his main concern in his work is to examine the past as a means of diagnosing the present. For Foucault, there was no essential order or meaning behind things, and everything was therefore to be judged according to a framework of knowledge which was forever changing. Foucault referred to the broad changes in intellectual outlooks as epistemes or epistemes, periodizations of knowledge, not dissimilar to Thomas Kuhn's paradigms. History for Foucault had to be understood according to the epistemes, the epistemes and discourses of the past. It was through a genealogical analysis of the past that we would inevitably gain some insight into the way in which the present had been produced. Unlike our two previous thinkers, we were looking at the question about whether they make it to America or not. Benjamin died tragically on his way, trying to get to America to flee Nazi-occupied Europe. Baudrillard made it to America and wrote very scathingly about America. Foucault, on the other hand, went to America and became a professor there. It's a visiting professor at UC Berkeley, and in some senses liked America too much. He died in 1984 as a result of AIDS that he contracted in a gay bar in San Francisco. What I want to do today is really offer no more than a kind of schematic outline of Foucault, trying to highlight some of the kind of key books, the key ideas and the key ways of thinking in his work, and to focus particularly on one particular discussion of one particular building, the Panopticon, and try and draw out the relevance of his discussion for architects. In a sense, what we're trying to do through this series is try and find out what architects can learn from philosophy. And by looking at some of these critical thinkers, all of whom were included in the book Rethinking Architecture, which was published almost 25 years ago, to really ask the question whether their thinking is still relevant to architecture today. So let me just briefly say that there are a series of books that Foucault was responsible for over the years from the 1970s through to 1984, of which possibly these are the most important. Madness and Civilization, The Birth of the Clinic, The Order of Things, The Archaeology of Knowledge, Discipline and Punish, and a 3-volume edition of The History of Sexuality, the final volume of which was published as Foucault was dying of AIDS. And while these kind of look at different subjects, it's fair to say there's a consistent kind of refrain or consistent approach, consistent critique that governs all of them. For example, he looks towards the past as a way of, in a sense, critiquing the present. While we're led to believe that things have improved over the time and the past is no longer so relevant, Foucault looks back to the past and looks for ideas that have been somehow lost or left behind as a way of critiquing the present. For example, the whole question about madness, about insanity becomes an issue, whereas in the past, individuals were somehow celebrated when they were somewhat insane as being different. Now they are consigned to some asylum and shut away. One thinks perhaps of some of the leading individuals in our world today. One thinks perhaps of people who suffer from something like Asperger's, which is seen as an abnormality. Albert Einstein had Asperger's, so does Greta Thunberg, and so does Elon Musk. Is it such an abnormality, or is it in some senses something special? This same kind of approach also, he took the same approach towards the question about medicine. Well, not denying that medical standards had in some sense improved, the problem was that somehow the patient had been somehow become part of a kind of clinic and diagnosed in a scientific way, and the sense of the person as totality had somewhat been lost. The same goes to to questions about criminality and punishment. Whereas in the past there were these somewhat gruesome public events that were being held. In some senses, the present is even worse. It's somewhat even more cruel in some senses, in the sense that the prisoners are just hidden behind in an institution. And it's almost, in some senses, worse for Foucault in that sense. In terms of the book Rethinking Architecture, I want to just kind of briefly look at the kind of genealogy, shall we say, of the way that Foucault approaches a particular subject, and that is the buildings and control. There are three articles or three pieces by Foucault in Rethinking Architecture of other spaces, utopias and heterotopias. And then there's the one that addresses the Panopticon itself, an extract from Discipline and Punish called Panopticism. And finally, there was an interview with Paul Rabinow called Space, Knowledge and Power. I want to address briefly the second and the third of these. And I also will add a few comments from an article by Gilles Deleuze, where he kind of, in a sense, adds to this kind of this line of thinking. What I want to suggest that this notion of the episteme, these different frames of thinking, these different ways of approaching things, which kind of echo in some senses the paradigms of Thomas Kuhn, see a sort of development from Foucault from a kind of a structuralist perspective, excuse me, towards a post-structuralist one, a more loose and kind of free way of thinking. And I want to trace that in the session today. So let me just say a few brief words about his essay of other spaces, utopias and heterotopias, where he's looking at these kind of spaces of otherness, that is to say, cemeteries, brothels, and so on. And although I won't go into this, it was more a kind of static notion, in the sense this is the space in which certain things are contained and certain practices take place. And he, in some sense, reflects his general sort of view that I was outlining in the way he describes this. The ship is the heterotopia par excellence. In civilizations where it is lacking, dreams dry up, adventure is replaced by espionage, and privateers by the police, which kind of reflects that general sort of shift in which maybe there are things from the past we can use to critique the present. But I want to focus for a moment on this particular building, Design for a Building, which forms part of Foucault's work. And I want to sort of reflect on what is its relevance for architecture. This is a version of the Panopticon, a design of the Panopticon that was initially devised by Jeremy Bentham in the 18th century. Jeremy Bentham was a social reformer and a philosopher. Disappointingly for Bentham, this was never acted upon. It was never actually built, although he got an architect to draw up the designs for it. But nonetheless, it was in subsequent years became the kind of model for many penitentiaries and prisons. Briefly put, what we have is a circular plan where there are cells around the outside in which the prisoners are housed. These are all radially designed so they look towards a central tower. The tower is where the guard operates. Now, importantly, the tower is kind of obscured by some kind of screen or gauze, whereby you're not aware of whether or not the guard is watching you. In other words, you are kept under under continuous kind of potential surveillance. You don't know if you've been watched, but you have to assume that you are being watched. And that, as Foucault puts it, guarantees the subjectification of the prisoners. They become, as a result of that, docile subjects because they internalize that gaze and are aware of the potential of always being seen by the guard. And this is the view that the guard would get, the central tower the tower in the center, which of course the prison does not know whether the guard is there watching. And of course the guard can't watch altogether, but nonetheless, that such is the kind of the ingenuity of the structure that there's this potential sense of always being watched. In some ways, this was actually realized by subsequently and became the model for a number of prisons throughout the world, almost identical to the concept that had been devised by Jeremy Bentham. And in many ways, also, you can see it being used in other ways, less draconian spaces, such as, for example, the City Library in Cambridge, the History Faculty Library, loved by architects, I should say, and hated by those who had to work here. As a student, when I was translating Alberti, I was a tenant of one of the faculty of the history faculty in Cambridge, who was no lover of this building. They tried, in fact, to have it demolished, but it was preserved. But the important point about this particular building is the way that it's been laid out in a similar kind of radial way. You can see from the plan here how all the stacks, as it were, are arranged in a sense so that you can be seen by the librarian at one particular point. By the time it was built, of course, the electronic tagging system had been introduced, whereby the books, in any case, were being tagged. But the principle behind it was that you could see if anyone was going to slip a book into their pocket or something and try and steal it. The idea of surveillance, of course, has been used all over the place. In the UK, we have these, on the motorways, we have these speed cameras. And the interesting thing about the speed cameras, and certainly in the old days, is that they used to warn you where there was going to be a speed camera. You had no idea whether or not there was any film in the camera or whether it was working or not. But as soon as you saw the sign, you slowed down. And in some senses, then the sign was more important than the camera itself. Of course, these days we have surveillance cameras everywhere. They're a part of how we operate, perhaps less noticeable, but nonetheless they're an essential part of existence today. So I want to sort of start off with this question: could there be an architecture of democracy? And I want to look at what architects have been thinking on this particular kind of subject. Famously, of course, Le Corbusier was well, most people are unaware of the fact that the original title proposed for Vers une architecture, towards a new architecture, the famous book by Le Corbusier, was Architecture or Revolution. The idea was that somehow that architecture could somehow prevent revolution. Somehow it had the capacity to influence social life and change. And in some senses, that idea that somehow architecture could influence people's behavior became central to kind of modernist thinking. If form follows function, then somehow certain forms should in some ways anticipate or encourage a certain form of behavior in a particular building. But can architecture influence? Can it either constrain or can it open up possibilities of certain forms of democratic behavior? Over the last 50 or so years, there have been a number of kind of commentaries on this, including one by Charles Jenks and Maggie Valentine, where they look at what it's supposed to be the architecture of democracy, which is to say, this kind of example of kind of variegated gables on houses on the canals in Amsterdam. Is that going to encourage democracy? Well, according to Jenks and Valentine, it does. In some sense, it is the symbolic use, the symbolic form, it somehow encourages it. More recently, Norman Foster, who was responsible for redesigning the Reichstag, made the main chamber in the German Parliament visible through glass. In other words, you could see democracy at work as though symbolically you became part of the democratic process. But although you could see democracy at work, does this actually allow you to be part of the democratic process? Is this encouraging, in some sense, an architecture of democracy. One can equally think about many buildings in which you can see them because they're glass boxes. You can see inside them, and yet you don't have access to them unless you have certain privileged status. Either these kind of the private dwellings, or indeed one can think of maybe buildings, restaurants, bars, and so on, where you can only get access if you have, as it were, the right credit card. I wanted to turn now to some further reflections by Foucault on this kind of question. And there is this interview which I mentioned with Paul Rabinow, where Rabinow asks him again about to what extent can a building control behavior. I mean, the implication at the first reading, it's very tempting, shall we say, when reading the discussion about the Panopticon, to assume that indeed that the building can influence behavior. But in this subsequent interview, in many ways, Foucault revisits this kind of question and qualifies, in some senses, his earlier statement. And it also, in some senses, reflects on a perception that many architects hold that somehow that architecture has some kind of political role, that somehow architecture can be fundamentally political. Some would argue, for example, there is a certain politics of the envelope. I'm not going to mention names here. And some would argue that if you were to position, let's say, a bath in a certain room, it is a political statement in some kind. It's a political act in itself. I would want to question, though, to what extent architecture can itself be political. That's not to say that there isn't certain politics in the way that an office operates, the kind of patriarchal values that might pervade an architectural office, or indeed in the way that the construction site operates. There are many examples throughout history. There's one example when the Karl Marx Allee was being constructed, the workers rebelled and the Russians sent in the tanks, and 12 of the workers were killed. And there are examples of, for example, there was a stadium by Zaha Hadid where a number of the construction workers were killed. Whether or not Zaha was responsible in any way for that is another question. But my point is, there is a politics of the office, there is a politics of the construction site. But the real question I want to ask is, to what extent can politics be? Can a building be political? And to what extent can an architect therefore have control of the user? Sorry, I think my thing muted there. Can I just repeat what I said? I'm sorry if I missed something there. So sorry, let me just repeat. What I want to do here is to look at the possibility of architecture controlling the behavior of the user. It's an assumption that architects have, that somehow they can design a building that will encourage or force the users to operate in a certain kind of way. And there is a discourse in architecture that would claim that architecture is in and of itself deeply political. There is a certain politics of the envelope, as some architectural commentators would say, or the fact that you could position, let's say, a bath in a certain space would make that a very political act. I would want to question that. At the same time, I'm not denying the fact there is a kind of certain politics, a certain political practice going on in the architectural office, whether it's governed by, say, patriarchal values. But I wouldn't deny the fact that on the construction site itself, there's also a certain politics of practice. And I would refer here to the case, for example, of the demonstrations that the workers held against their conditions in the building of the Karl Marx Allee in East Berlin, and the fact that the Russians sent in the tanks and 12 of the workers were killed. Likewise, I'd refer to the loss of life in one of the stadiums designed by Zaha Hadid. Not that she was responsible for it, where a number of workers are being killed. Clearly, there is a politics in terms of the practices going on, but I want to question or call into question to what extent a building can be political in and of itself, something that we will maybe pick up on a bit more next week. So, and I want to refer here to some sort of comments that were made by Foucault. And one of the comments that he makes is very, very, very straightforward. The architect doesn't control me. The architect has no power over me. If I want to tear down or change a house he built for me, put up new partitions, add a chimney. The architect has no control. And one thinks, for example, of maybe a design for a particular kind of building that maybe is used in a different sort of way. The Architectural Association in London is, of course, housed in a structure that was designed as a house initially. In fact, the whole of Bedford Square was designed as a row of houses, and now it's become a series of offices. In fact, my publishers, Bloomsbury, are located also on Bedford Square. The fact that it was designed as a house doesn't prevent it from being used in many different sort of ways. The architect has no control over that. And Foucault points to the kind of critique, as it were, of the idea that somehow an object has some kind of any particular impact. In fact, unless you subscribe to Bruno Latour's notion of actor network theory, whereby objects are part of a kind of having a role to play. In a sense, what Foucault is pointing towards is the fact that actually the politics is a practice. Liberty is a practice. I do not think that there's anything that is functionally, by its very nature, absolutely liberating. Liberty is a practice. And he refers to Le Corbusier as being somebody who has now perceived as being some sort of kind of crypto-Stalinist, but nonetheless he probably had good intentions, like many architects, and was dedicated to liberating effects. Whether or not he was able to do that is another question. As he puts it, I think that it can never be inherent in the structure of things to guarantee the exercise of freedom. The guarantee of freedom is freedom. In other words, Foucault repeats over and over again the fact that it's not up to buildings to either cause freedom or to control people. It is really to do with the practices that are taking place there. If one were to find a place, and perhaps there are some, where liberty is effectively exercised, one would find that this is not owing to the order of objects, but once again owing to the practice of liberty. Nonetheless, he points out, I think that architecture can and does produce positive effects when the liberating intentions of the architect coincide with the real practice of people in the exercise of freedom. The way that I interpret this is to say that actually the buildings could be understood in terms of their affordances. And here I want to refer to the work of James Gibson, The Ecological Approach to Visual Perception, where he elaborates, among other things, this idea that somehow that buildings have a certain affordance. By that I mean not that buildings have any agency, that they're able to kind of able to do anything themselves. Rather, the fact that you can use them in a certain kind of way. And some things, rather than saying they lend themselves to something, they can be used effectively for something. I mean, a knife could be used both to chop up your vegetables, but also as a murder weapon. But you wouldn't see a knife on trial for murder. It's a question of who is using it and for what. Likewise, you can think about a hammer, which is, let's say, it's good for using to bang in nails, and one could possibly imagine the possibility of using a screwdriver to bang in nails, but it wouldn't be so good. Likewise, you could imagine maybe fixing screws using a knife or some other implement, but a screwdriver would clearly be better for this. This, in a sense, is a very brief summary of the theory of affordance. The other two comments I'd make briefly about, I think, the dangers of misreading this Panopticon is, first of all, it's referred to by Foucault as an example of dispositif, which loosely translated means apparatus. And I think as architects, we tend to think about them as tools, as apparatuses, and think of them in a certain sort of way. But Foucault points out that the apparatus is a system of relations that can be established between various elements, and he refers here to the apparatus is a heterogeneous ensemble consisting of discourses, institutions, architectural forms, regulatory decisions, laws, administrative measures, scientific statements, philosophical, moral, and philanthropic propositions. In short, it's a question of kind of situating it in its particular discourse. The point being that the Panopticon is being used as a prison, and it affords that possibility, but it equally could be used in a different sort of way. You could imagine the Panopticon being, let's say, a nightclub or something. The second point I want to stress is that actually that Foucault describes the Panopticon as a diagram of the mechanisms of power. Now, we're, as architects, we're used to the notion of the diagram of a building, but this is a building which becomes a diagram of the way that power is exercised. And that, I think, is importantly how Foucault perceives of the Panopticon in his discourse. So finally, let me just kind of make a comment here of an additional kind of a comment made by Gilles Deleuze in a short text postscript to Society of Control, where in some senses he goes beyond that particular kind of perception, in the sense that you can see a progression from the notion of heterotopia through to the Panopticon in terms of the erosion of the hegemony of the physical, whereby the physical world doesn't control us so much as other forms of operation. Then there's a possibility of a further step. And Deleuze refers to Guattari's notion of an electronic card, which he envisions, but of course has become a reality now, which is a way that you get access to certain sort of spaces. Arguably, we've gone even further than that in the sense that now we have other ways of accessing things based on facial recognition. And soon, no doubt, we will not need to have any keys or indeed pass cards or indeed money, because facial recognition is already being used in certain countries for purchasing certain items. And so for Deleuze, there is a shift that occurs from in a society of control where you move to a different form of operation. The factory was a body that contained its internal forces at a level of equilibrium, the highest possible in terms of production, the lowest possible in terms of wages. But in a society of control, the corporation has replaced the factory, and the corporation is a spirit, a gas. In other words, it's something that is not physical. It is in many ways invisible. And he talks about this sort of shift from the spaces of enclosure towards a different society of control. We have passed from one animal to another, from the mole to the serpent, in the system under which we live, but also in our manner of living, in our relations with others. The disciplinary man was a discontinuous producer of energy, but the man of control is undulatory, in orbit, in a continuous network. Everywhere, surfing has already replaced the older sports. I include that reference there partly because both Peter and Bernard are themselves avid surfers. I should add that actually I found out the reason why this was actually the case was that apparently, according to John Reitman, there was surfers became obsessed with Deleuze since Deleuze started talking about the fold, the pli. Probably a misunderstanding of Deleuze, no doubt, but nonetheless, as he kind of referred to surfers in this particular reference because of his fan club, as it were, within the world of surfing. So just to sum up, the coils of a serpent are even more complex than the burrows of a molehill. Man is no longer enclosed, but man in debt. That's an important sort of comment. The physical, the hegemony of the physical has been eroded, and now the ways in which one is controlled are no longer so much physical constraints, so much as questions such as debt. I made reference to this in an article I wrote back in 2005 about Tony Blair in London, where I was referring to precisely some of these ideas. And London, of course, was not only where Jeremy Bentham wrote the Panopticon, but it's also where George Orwell wrote 1984. And since the IRA bombings, London became the most heavily surveilled city in the world. I'm not sure whether that is still the case, but London is certainly no stranger to surveillance. What is interesting, perhaps, are the certain shifts that have happened since then. In the UK, notably, there was a moment in 1993 when a young child called Jamie Bulger was abducted and subsequently killed by two older children, and the way that they managed to catch those people was through the use of a CCTV camera from a mother care shop in a shopping mall, a shopping arcade in the UK. So in some senses, suddenly the notion of surveillance as being inherently bad was challenged by the notion that surveillance could, in some senses, protect you. And for many people, to have CCTV cameras is a source of assurance of their safety. Equally, you could take that notion that maybe Big Brother has itself been somehow inverted from the kind of the Orwellian notion of the Big Brother is watching you to the Big Brother reality TV show whereby somehow you invite the gaze. And there is a form of masquerade. You are aware that you are being watched and you develop strategies and tactics to deal with it. One can think about this maybe in terms of the strategy of the burqa. You're wearing a burqa, but underneath you can wear your Gucci underwear or whatever. The idea is that you are constantly aware that you are being watched, and yet you are playing within that system. And of course, more recently, Slavoj Žižek, among others, has commented on the fact that maybe surveillance is inherently necessary in times of COVID to be able to track those who have have the virus. So it seems that attitudes towards surveillance are at least being challenged from the previous notion that surveillance was inherently bad. And above all, I want to avoid the danger of technological determinism, of assuming, in some other words, that any particular technology or any particular kind of system is either good or bad. It's really a question of how it's been used. Finally, I want to sort of comment on this notion that the idea of somehow that the glass box was somehow a sign of democracy that was opening up in some sort of way. In this article about London, I was talking about how these glass boxes existed, all these restaurants, these trendy bars and so on. Did that mean anything else special? Did it mean that it was democratizing space in any way? And I point instead towards this, the way in which in some senses there is a form of control that's operating, an invisible form of control, a form of architecture to do with kind of credit, which in some senses defines where or not you can afford to live and so on. That, it seems to me, is in the spirit of this notion that Deleuze was talking about, is a way to understand how control it really is operating in the city today. So I'm going to